Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session. I'm Stéphanie Schmidt, Director for Partnership with Ashoka in Africa. I'm calling today from slightly cloudy Johannesburg, and I'm thrilled to hold this session about demystifying system change and learning from African leaders. So we are really glad that you are joining the Future Summit today, and especially this session that's that's connected to a topic that's fully connected to our collective search for profound social change in Africa. So that's particularly relevant as the COVID-19 crisis has worsened inequalities in terms of gender, in terms of wealth, in terms of education, and so many other topics. So system change can be sometimes seen as a Western topic, as a complex topic. And today we want to explore together how African leaders, why and how African leaders have adopted system change strategies. And our goal for the session is twofold. On one hand, we'd like to create greater understanding about system change for practitioners, for entrepreneurs, for NGO leaders. And on the other hand, also create greater awareness for investors, for donors about the need to support system changers in Africa through funding, but also through access to decision makers and circle of influence. So in the last year, the idea of system change has also gained momentum. So even if the term system change has almost become a buzzword. And this was an exciting trend for us at Ashoka. Since the early days, Ashoka has always sort of connected the topic or the concept of social entrepreneurship with the concept of system change. There's a sentence that we use a lot at Ashoka that's actually coined by our CEO and founder, Bill Drayton, about system change. So social entrepreneurs are not just content to give a fish or to teach how to fish. They won't rest until they revolutionize the fishing industry. So that's obviously very ambitious, but it's really connect with the core of our conversation today is how can we go beyond direct impact and how can we try to affect the very conditions that host the social problems in place and to address those social problems at their roots. So enough with introduction, but we are, really privileged to have a very rich panel with us today. We have 3 speakers joining us from Eswatini, from Uganda, and from South Africa. So I'd like to introduce Nombulelo Mbokazi, the Executive Director of the Agenda 2063 Academy in Eswatini. So Nombulelo will share insights about a very recent and interesting study about 40 system change leaders in Africa and in North America. Then I'm very glad to introduce Joseph Nkandu, the Executive Director and founder of NUCAFE in Uganda. Joseph is also an Ashoka Fellow since, I believe, 2013. And last but not least, welcome Kovin. So Kovin is an Ashoka Fellow as well since 2006, I believe. And Kovin is the Vice President for Social Impact and Advocacy at Essilor. So welcome to the speakers, welcome to all of you again. Before we start our conversation with the speaker, I'd like to invite all of you to actively participate to the conversation on the chat. So you may want to introduce yourself. We'd love to know how you are. And as the conversation goes, please share questions for the speakers as well. So we'll have a bit of time for the Q&A towards the end of the session, and my wonderful colleague Dadisai will be harvesting those questions from you. So as my first question actually would go to Kovin. So Kovin, as a social entrepreneur, could you maybe tell us about the social problem you are addressing and why did you decide actually to adopt system change strategies?
Thank you very much, and thank you to Ashoka for including me in this discussion, especially when I know there are many people out there much better skilled than I am to contribute to this discussion. I operate in the eye care space. There are 1 billion people in the world who are visually impaired. And most of these people, and that's according to the WHO recent World Report on Vision, about 124 million of those people don't have eye exams and glasses, mainly for distance. But 826 million of people don't have reading glasses, which for many of us and people in the developed world, those are so easily accessible. But if you don't use the WHO classification and you use the, Essilor's Eliminating Poor Vision in a Generation report classification that looks at people who have problems with their vision, that number goes up to 2.7 billion. In Africa alone, there are 80% of the people have near vision problems because they cannot access poor vision. So that's the challenge that we are addressing. We also know that by 2050, half of the world's population will be short-sighted. Africa will have a 4 times increase in the number of people that are short-sighted. So the world, and Africa in particular, is heading towards an even bigger crisis. We are starting with a crisis where we haven't addressed that. And that's essentially what I'm looking at addressing. In terms of the problem, beyond that, we have very poor human resource in Africa. The number of optometrists is 1 to more than 1 million in some countries, whereas in the developed world is 1 to 5,000. And we have pockets of excellence in a sea of despair because we have excellent social entrepreneurship programs, NGO programs, etc. But the reality is we are not making a sufficiently large impact. We have all, at a national level. And so that's the issue that's being addressed. It's about making sure that systems change occurs, and system change would look at addressing the policy issues. In many parts of Africa, the policy is even tougher than some parts of the developed world. Our governments have amazing policies that they've copied from other people. So for example, the role of non-optometrists in eye care is a major issue. The use of telemedicine and other technology is a big issue in healthcare. But the policies, strict as they may be, are not backed up by the access that is created by governments. The public sector and private sector don't collaborate with each other. And that's why we need to have that systems change where we bring them together. And in many cases, the private sector don't see value at the bottom of the pyramid. And system change has allowed us to look at our issue in a much more broader way. And the broader way, for example, we know that vision is linked to road safety. So we're linking up with the road safety campaign. We know that it's linked to productivity. We showed that there was $244 billion per annum in lost productivity as a result of poor vision. So we know that a system change approach that says, let's look at bringing all factors that impact on vision to work together to effect change and bring all sectors of society that are part of the process, not just a service delivery approach, makes absolute sense. And so that's the main reason for us adopting a systems change approach. And system change allows us to change the various components within that. We are changing the eye health system in a narrow sense, but we are changing the public health system by utilizing all components of society that are affected, can influence vision, and looking at policy change and other aspects of society that actually can. Thank you.
Thank you, Kovin. The connection dropped for a few seconds, but I think we could hear your message, and indeed the numbers are overwhelming. That's the main sort of a very compelling reason to start working on system change. So now I'd like to turn to you, Joseph, with the same kind of question. As a social entrepreneur, what kind of social issue are you tackling? And why did you decide at some point to also embrace system change in your strategies?
Thank you very much, Stéphanie, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this opportunity to share with you a bit about the approach of system change. The world over, we have at least 100 million smallholder coffee farmers that are involved in the cultivation of coffee. And you will discover that there is a disconnect, between what the smallholder coffee farmers get and what industry and trade, get. So we are trying to work on the paradox, on the discrepancies that exist within agricultural value chains. And we started with coffee, because coffee presents a global coffee value chain. And this is where you find that this value chain globally generates over $4 billion every day. But out of that, the smallholder coffee farmers earn less than 10% of that trade value. And these smallholder coffee farmers, from generation to generation, are held in abject poverty. And one would see no progress in as far as this lucrative commodity value chain is concerned. Therefore, time came, and just from my personal experience, seeing that my parents were involved in the production of this lucrative commodity, but again, I suffered so much, from my parents not earning enough to keep myself in school. So I would, from time to time, be asked to leave school because of untimely payment of school fees. So this kind of discrepancy, it is something that I have grown up with, and it is something that I felt necessary that it needed to be tackled. It needed to be tackled systemically to ensure that we resolve this perpetual problem, not only in the coffee value chain, but also in other agricultural value chains. This kind of paradox exists, and it is clear, you would see it clearly between North and South, that where coffee is produced, and especially when we talk about Africa, which is the cradle, which is the birthplace of coffee, this is where you find real poverty from generation to generation. And whereas those involved in trade and industry are always, in a boom. Therefore, this discrepancy of crisis in the South and then boom in trade and industry in the North, it is something that collectively, we decided to work on within NUCAFE, and then later on joined by many other stakeholders, because it was felt that it needed to take a systemic, kind of approach.
Thank you, Joseph, and thanks for reminding us of the importance and urgency to change those economic systems that kind of hold poverty in place. So we'll get back to your project, Kovin and Joseph, but in the meanwhile, I wanted to ask Nombulelo to share maybe a little bit of the insights of these recent studies. I think if you're interested, we'll share the study with you in a few weeks. But this is still an unpublished study. So could you share with us, Nombulelo, like how did the study come out and what were the main insights?
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Stéphanie, for having me in this rich conversation. And I'm really much proud to be part of this and inspired to be part of this rich conversation. But before I proceed, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Ashoka Africa for shaping the research in Africa around Signal projects, and to the MasterCard Foundation for providing funding for this. So Signal is a global research initiative to help build a system and a platform for supporting leaders around the world who are doing systems change work. And this particular report that I will be sharing was basically done between two continents, being Africa and North America. And we had a sample of 40 systems leaders that we interviewed, that were interviewed, and they shared their insights and their experiences and how they've been, how their work has been happening over the years. And the key objectives of it was to understand effective practices in systems change. What's really working, what's not. To understand what diverse system leaders are around the world need in terms of inspiration, learning, support, and culturally relevant approaches. To source insights to guide our collective efforts to help systems leaders to improve their leadership capabilities, systems practices, and impact. And to just also engage more people in reflecting on how we can collectively scale systems leadership, its capacity, its connectivity, and impact. Just a quick question to you, Stéphanie. I'm just wondering if I go ahead to share the insights right away, or we'll come back to that question of sharing the 3 key insights that I picked from the report.
Yes, please. Yeah, you can share the 3 insights with us. That would be great.
Oh, okay, great. So, well, the reports, I must say, before I go ahead and share what came out, it's a long report, and I believe that anybody who's interested in learning more about it can please maybe have their names on the chat box, because we'll be launching it officially. So would really like to send you invites and so that you can be part of the launch and the overall harvest of the report. So one of the key insights that came out was that several systems leaders from Africa expressed passion for restoring and cultivating narrative of success based on our African values and approaches in their work. One leader, for an example, noted that over the years, we've been taught to believe that homegrown solutions are ineffective. And they said that this narrative needs paradigm shifts. And another one also expressed that there's an urgent need to build our people, their mentalities, our value system, and what it means to be successful in Africa. Another key insight that stood out was the issue of evolving funding mindsets around the continent. To shift away from a prescriptive funding mentality, there's need to move away from the expert model, but instead to learn for anybody who's going into communities, to learn from what's happening around the communities and allow theories to emerge than to already have preconceived ideas of what the solution should be about. There's also one leader who noted that there's little aid that goes into development work into local organizations. So these funding disparities affect not only the relative resource levels, but it also reinforces the narrative of local leaders being perceived as ineffective. And lastly, there was a large consensus that developing systems leadership is very important in the capacity of it. While leaders' definition of systems thinking varied, most identified this as another key focus in developing their systems leadership capabilities. There's interest in systems thinking that came in various forms. For an example, some people have struggles to define the scope of systems thinking, and also to how to ask fundamental questions, how to evaluate what opportunities are promising for change. Finally, one leader noted that, or rather had a key question, that how do we look at the general layout of the country and economy and be able to look at the landscape, the context, the tools and deficiencies, and put it all together to produce a viable path forward. So for now, I think this is where I will post, since the report is really long, but I am happy to share more, and especially to announce to anybody who'd be interested when the launch will be for the report. Thank you, Stephanie. I'll give it back to you.
Thank you, Nombulelo. There's indeed a lot to unpack sort of from the study, and we will be actually sharing a form if you want to register and receive the study in the chat. So in order to sort of, learn again from the practitioners' experience, I'd like to turn back to you, Kovin. And so what you said, earlier is that, you talked about the overwhelming number, the need to change an industry. So that sounds definitely sort of very important, but it could also be quite daunting for, social entrepreneurs. So could you tell us a little bit what this meant for you as a social entrepreneur, for your organization, to go from working at a direct impact to, to embracing systemic changes? Did it mean a new set of activities, different skill sets in your organization, maybe also a different style of leadership? So very curious to hear from your experience.
Thank you. So I think that when we made that shift, and this was much of my previous role, especially in my previous role in the nonprofit organization that I was leading, we had been having some fantastic success at a micro level. We were conducting projects, and then we found after a while it was the same things that we were doing over and over. And that's why we went to a broader approach to change the system. But it demands certain internal changes. And the first thing is expulsion of ego. Because a lot of times that when you have total control of the project, you are the person in charge, or you are the organization in charge, your organization gets all the credit, your organization is seen in the forefront of all the media, etc. But the reality is that when we shift to a systems change approach, it's about the collective. It's about all the different sectors, all the different organizations, the components working together. Secondly, you had to take a long-term view of success. If someone says, go and conduct a school IELTS program and you have to see 500 kids, you could do that, you can take your pictures, you can make the claim, all of that. But systems change is about changing the school IELTS policy. It's about ensuring that you are linking up with child IELTS programs or child support programs, ensuring that those children that come from poor backgrounds can get the access they need or be supported. And so anti-poverty organizations, for example, become your partners. We partnered with Nissan, for example, that was running a nutrition program in schools and brought that into the school IELTS program. And all of that takes a lot of effort and a lot of rethink about the way you run your organization. We had to do financial remodeling because right now we had a situation before it was very clear. You put a proposal, you send your clinicians out there, you see the patients, and you make an impact. Now you're talking about activity that goes beyond even those clinicians. You have to look at your staffing to include people with advocacy skills, people who understand how to change policy and how to engage government about changing. So those were significant changes we had to make in our composition. And the other important thing is that you now got to build coalitions, and that takes a different kind of approach. You've got to bring people together who you may have even competed with for funding. You've got to bring people from who you've seen as outside your sector, and you now need to work with them. For example, people with road safety, and they're not going to only talk about vision. They're going to talk about other things, and you have to look at how your agenda morphs into their agenda and how that can then be amplified at a national level. And funding applications take on a new form now. So at some level, you're going to have to look at your staffing. We had to, in many ways, become more nimble, even reduce staffing because we didn't have the budgets to be able to do both. And it doesn't necessarily mean getting rid of people, because some of the people can actually shift to the coalitions and those kind of structures rather than staying just within your organization. So it's quite a lot of change that you've got to make in terms of wanting to operate at a systems level. But the most important thing is to have a shared vision with others, which is not always the easiest thing to develop, and it's not always the easiest thing to share the platforms.
Thanks, Kovin. Oh, please, sorry, go ahead.
I just want to say that there are some African peculiarities around these issues as well, that we need to address in, actually, I'll come back to that at a later point. We had spoken, I'll address that in another question if we don't have time. But if we have time, I don't mind going ahead with it.
We have time, so yeah, feel free to share.
Yeah, I wanted to, reflect on some of the African peculiarities in systemic change. Our governments, more than I've worked in other parts of the world, have a much more bigger influence over policy in ICARE, for example. But the policy doesn't match the access or the budgets that they may put on the table. So as a result, we have to work with governments and bring them towards a more collaborative approach, which is not always easy. For example, governments may not want you to charge for spectacles, but won't allocate a budget for spectacles. So access doesn't happen, right? But they say we can't charge in the public sector. So there's a big mind shift change that's going to happen that in Africa we have to address if we want to be engaging in system change. In businesses in Africa, don't see the bottom of the pyramid often as being a viable option. In ICARE, when they can cream off the 20% of the population, a lot of the private practitioners, for example, are busy enough because there's so few optometrists. So they don't necessarily want to invest at the bottom of the pyramid. It's about getting big businesses to have a long-term view and see the value of that. And then there's a lot of donor-driven agendas that influence us in Africa. I mean, the donor wants numbers that must be delivered by the end of the year so they can round up their annual report. Now, to convince donors to think differently about it is a major challenge for us in Africa. And I think we have to engage in this collectively, because while we may talk about health and eye care, others are talking about other issues to USAID or deferred. And we have to start collectively influencing the way that they see their investment being deployed in Africa. And if that doesn't change, I do think that systems change is going to be a huge challenge for us. And just the last point is that failure to see gold is the biggest problem we faced in Africa. People will write to you and ask you for funding, but don't realize that they could create a social entrepreneurship program and become self-sustainable because there's no services there. And as Africans, we have to start addressing what we are doing for ourselves and pushing more people. Yes, the Ashoka Fellows talk, we talk about what we're doing for the continent, etc. But that means nothing if we don't influence the constituencies around us to start seeing what they could do and mine the value that exists within our communities to serve our communities. And that's a big challenge that we face on the continent. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Kovin. Like a wealth of, of experience that you've shared very briefly. So Joseph, I'd love also to turn to you. And so Kovin talked about sort of the importance of first, changing from ego to sort of collective leadership to build coalition. How does it resonate for you? Did you have the same kind of shift from direct impact to system change?
Yeah, I think there is a lot of commonality between what Kovin has gone through and what really I have experienced. And as far as, I'm concerned, of course, it had to start with a mindset change, involving the smallholder farmers to appreciate the fact that it is themselves to cause this change and not to wait for anybody else to come. And if somebody else was there to come, well and good, but they had to be masters of their own destiny. And therefore, we had to organize ourselves. So I simply became a catalyst, a facilitator of organizing these smallholder farmers into small associations and cooperatives. That was first and foremost something that was needed. We needed numerical strength because that means a lot to the powers, to the authorities, because we needed to influence policy. We needed for the first time to speak to policy that really speaks to the coffee farmers that needed an enabling policy for their progress. So this is something number one that we took upon ourselves. And what was most critical was to take ownership by farmers themselves. And then from those very farmers, we had to cultivate compassionate leadership. This was something that was very, very important for leaders that don't think for themselves, but leaders that think for the very coffee farmers, leaders that think for communities where these coffee farmers live. And then later on, it was also very, very important that we enhance the skill sets of ourselves and of the people that we are working with. Because we looked at the entire value chain, and the entire value chain presents different skill sets. And therefore, this also pushed us to working closely with educational institutions. So we had to work with the universities, and therefore bringing universities and industry much closer. And this meant that as farmers and their employees would acquire the necessary skills, this would help them to capture more value which has been missing to them and which had always been taken up by others. Therefore, this industry and university collaboration also became very, very important, but we had to take it on by ourselves. And then from that, we started to advocate very, very strongly for Uganda to come up with the first ever national coffee policy, which was in 2013, formulated. But remember, we started way back in 2008, but it was later in 2013 that it was realized. As if that was not good enough, we felt it also necessary that a national law was needed, a national law to operationalize the policy. And I want to tell you that it is this year that the national coffee law also, the president assented to it, and now it is in operational. So this is the kind of organic approach to engaging the authorities, to engaging the powers, to engaging the academic institutions, to engaging even research in terms of even the innovations that we needed to come to the smallholder coffee farmers for them to use and enhance the productivity, and then also make a collective investment which was never there before. So this is how you are able to see different parts of the ecosystem being tackled in a systemic way to ensure that you achieve progress, which was never the case before. So this is how we managed organically to evolve and become a force, a meaningful force, seen positively and not in a negative way. And then we have seen ourselves making this kind of progress. And then later on, we've seen even universities coming to us and say, now, as you have engaged us, please take leadership in curriculum reforms. This is why today I'm the chair of curriculum reforms with one of the universities in the country. We had also to create, an agribusiness incubator to help the younger people within universities that before they graduate, they are able to acquire certain skill sets that are not part of the university curricula. So, and by acquiring those skill sets, by the time they graduate and join the world market, they have the necessary skills, and you don't suffer so much going through, retraining and reskilling. So this is why partly it explains why a systemic approach is very, very important, because the bottom of the pyramid has lots of challenges that there is no single solution, no single approach can just be able to solve, the kind of challenges that these people at the bottom of the pyramid are in. Because if it comes to policy, the policy is affecting and therefore it needs to be addressed. When it comes to the education system needs to change because it does not speak to the reality within our own context. And therefore that needs to change. And if you don't tackle it, you are not about to make a progress. Then how about research? Research that we know is for the, much more developed industry and does not speak to the communities, that we are talking about. And therefore, these various components that we bring together by way of a systemic approach help to ensure that you make a progress. And we have seen progress whereby the smallholder farmers that were earning far less than 10%, making progress and improving their incomes by at least 250%. And then we see major influence that the smallholder farmers have, and that no policy can pass without having heard from these smallholder farmers. Now we occupy spaces of influence in terms of representation. Otherwise, hitherto, farmers were always at the periphery. Now, this is something that we find very, very pertinent, and that all the other challenges notwithstanding, at least we see progress being made. Over to you, Stéphanie.
Congratulations, Joseph, on the successful implementation of the new policy for coffee. So that's an excellent news. One follow-up question for you, Joseph, in terms of when you talk to peer social entrepreneurs, maybe beyond Africa, have you seen certain particularities about embracing system change in Africa? Any things you would like to share about that?
Yeah. Particularities, one, it is to do with the policy, itself. Because we know in Africa that it's governments that come up with the policies. But as far as we are concerned, we knew very well that there were people who were benefiting from not having policy. And even some people within the government were benefiting from not having, the policy. And therefore, it was incumbent upon ourselves as farmers to take on government, to engage government, to ensure that it comes up with a policy that also takes care of the smallholder farmers, but which policy also, once you are not able to follow a shared vision and direction, then whether you are a big company, whether you are in authority, then the policy and the law will catch up with you. So this is a particular, case that we would see in this part of the world, that you don't simply have to sit back and wait for whether government or somebody else to do it for you. Not at all. The other particular aspect is to do with, influencing curricula of the universities. We know very well that universities are regarded as ivory towers. Who is that smallholder farmer to talk about curriculum reforms? Who is that from industry? You don't have a PhD, you don't have a master's degree. How do you influence curriculum reforms? But we are saying, wait a minute. We are the ones in the marketplace. We know what the market wants. And therefore, it is important for our participation at the time when curriculum reforms are taking place. These are important aspects. Why? Because a curriculum must speak and have focus with the context of that region, of that country, but not only to pick on curricula from elsewhere, which is not going to apply to that particular ecological area. So these are some of the areas that particularly we have paid attention to. And, with the time, it had to take a bit of time. There is some degree of patience that is required. And it is important to do power mapping across value chains. Power mapping within the ecosystem is very, very important. And it is important to realize that probably the power may not reside with the minister, and that power may reside with the secretary to the minister, because the secretary can deny you entry to see the minister, and many other things. And we have to be agile and flexible, in our advocacy processes. Thank you, Stéphanie.
Thanks, Joseph. So I want to remind actually those who are listening to us that, feel free to share the questions through the chat. We want to keep a bit of time for Q&A, question answer in a few minutes. But before we get to the Q&A, Kovin, I'd like to get back to you in terms of what would be your main lessons learned, or some key messages that you would like to share about your system change journey, maybe with peer social entrepreneurs, or even with donor, because you also talked about the importance of changing also some of the investment practices.
The most critical thing is to ensure that we take a long-term view. I mean, we were involved in all this ICARE programs and getting these short-term outputs, but we were not able to scale up at a, especially with the child IL programs and some of the community-based programs and even the government-based programs that we're involved in. And, the only way we started getting that was when we embraced systems change and started looking at policy change, bringing in other role players, etc., which we have spoken about. So I think you have to take a long-term view of what you want to achieve. But a lot of us go out there and promise donors, and we promise the communities that we're going to make all these changes and that it will happen very quickly. Now, it is easy to say that, for example, I had facilitated a child IL program in East Africa, and we reached 2 million kids. We raised almost $2 million for that program. And yes, when we initially went out, everyone just wanted to talk about the numbers. But then we said, look, what are the other factors that are involved that come to play in this? What are the policies that are preventing? When we are over with this funding, how are we going to sustain it? And how are we going to make sure that there are other resources that are mobilized to make sure that children still have eye care? And when we did that mapping, and when we looked at all these factors and adopted a more systems approach to it, we ended with a totally different strategy than where we started off with. And I think it's important to then take a long-term view that this is not a 2-year donor program, but this is actually a 5-year program, because even beyond the donor, we would have to invest, because some of the donors were not prepared to support other aspects. With them, it was about the service delivery as such. So I think it's very important to do that. And in order to then show success to others who may want to invest in the program, we had to relook at our metrics. You got to go away from patients, you got to move to access. How many people have we created access for? How many children had school eye health programs available to, or had access to eye exams beyond the program? And those things usually don't get counted, because those are not the things that bring the money. It's the number of children and the number of glasses, which we count. So in my current role, well, I'll give you 2 examples. One is there's an NGO in Africa called One Sight, and they works in Africa. It's a global NGO. They have about 100 vision centers, and their metric is mainly emphasizing access, which is good, because it then puts pressure on them to show how they are creating that sustainable access. What is the link with primary healthcare? What is the link with child support programs? How are you linked to the gender agenda, considering that women often don't get access to care, get lesser access to care than men do? How do you make that link between all of that? So it places a different responsibility when you talk about sustainable access. What we do in my current role, what Essilor does is a combination of the short-term metrics and the long-term metrics, because there's certain pressure on us to account for, in terms of this certain need for us to account for what we're doing. So we'll talk about the number of eye exams, the number of spectacles provided, but we also talk about the more longer term issues is about how many people access was created for, how many entrepreneurs were developed, etc. So I think the important thing for us is that we have to develop new metrics to support systemic change. Because if we don't define the metrics, then the old metrics will define us. And that will never allow us to move towards true system change. Because when we can't pay our bills at the end of the month for our NGOs, we're going to then apply for that program that says, give glasses to 50 people, okay? But if we had metrics that are different and we can influence that, I think then as social entrepreneurs, we would be able to then create a much more enabling environment in Africa around systemic change. Thank you.
Thanks a lot for sharing your learning, Kovin, and yeah, fully agree with you about the need to define more sort of new metrics and sort of metrics of success towards system change, this long-term goal. Nombulelo, I'm turning back to you and curious to hear more about the study. And what would be the main recommendation emerging from the study in terms of continuing to build this field of system change in Africa?
Hi, Stéphanie. Thank you for having me again. The main recommendation, based on the overall research itself, it's really to rethinking and redesigning what the current approaches are. For an example, how do we get old systems thinking how do we get the new systems thinking around traditional leaders, and how do we get old school decision makers to get out of their comfort zone, and so that they can be more open-minded and understand what the new approaches can be, since most of them, from the overall information that we got from the research, was that most of them are still conservative thinkers, and it's really a challenge to get them to adapt to new approaches and new ways of systematic thinking. So that would mean that we have to gather together as systems thinkers from all over the continent, and together co-create and curate solutions that will solve the issues that we currently have. But mainly it's really communities learning from each other, figuring out what's working, what's not working, be open to experimenting and discarding even approaches that are not working. So that's the in a nutshell, that's the overall recommendation.
Thank you so much, Nombu. Joseph, I want to ask you the same question maybe as Kovin, in terms of, now you have years of experience of working on system change, and what could be your main recommendation or sort of words of advice to social entrepreneurs, to donors? And we got a new question also from the chat, which is, and for all of you actually, do you have any recommendation to young Africa leaders working in the public or business sector? So how can they become allies in this system change work?
Good, thank you. First and foremost, it is important for social entrepreneurs to understand the problem they are working on within the context of the entire ecosystem. I think that is something quite important if you are to approach this problem from a systemic change approach. Two, building a business model. Building a business model that is different from the existing models, and that it offers a difference to those who are affected by the challenge that exists. Three, institutional building. Along the way, I have come to appreciate how important it is to mobilize, to organize, and build a critical mass of people to create that numerical strength that is required to confront a problem. Number three, team building. One needs people to work with, and you have to inculcate compassion within your team. And patience is very, very important. Like what my colleague Kovin referred to, a long view of things, not quick fixing. Quick fixes cannot take forward a systemic, kind of approach, not at all. And therefore, a long-term view of things is very, very important. But one needs to carry out power mapping. Power mapping is very, very important, because by doing that, you know exactly who to talk to, who are those authorities, with the power. Power may not necessarily reside in the top leadership. It may be somewhere, and this needs, a lot of time, and patience. And when it comes to where you are able to get your resources, you have to closely liaise with donors and ensure that they appreciate the fact that it is not only about how many people you are able to reach out to as one of your key performance indicator, but about also the influence, which comes in later, about changing systems, whether within government department or within university. So it's not the common KPIs, not at all. So it is something that sees that collective responsibility coming from those you are advocating with, and then you are able to see organically impact, taking shape, and then later on, it is the sustainability that you are looking for. And in all this, ensuring succession planning, as a leader on top of leadership is very, very important. I submit.
Thank you, Joseph. I see a lot of very interesting questions coming from the chat. I don't think we'll have time, unfortunately, to address all of those. Actually, I take the opportunity to invite all of you who are listening to us today to take part also in a new initiative that Ashoka will launch with the BMW Foundation start of 2022. We've called it for now Roots of Change, and we want to continue those conversations with social entrepreneurs and with leaders from different sectors to kind of unpack this concept of system change. So I think there's a link being shared. So please, sign up if you're interested in continuing this conversation beyond today. But for now, I don't know if some of the speakers, Joseph, Kovin, Nombu, if you want to pick one of the questions, an interesting one or something that sounds interesting to me is also, how could we help Africans understand that system change is not a Western thing? I don't know if you want to share any last thoughts, Kovin?
Yeah, I think, it surprises me that I think it's because we're not talking about it more than anything else. If you look in African culture, it's always about the village elders coming together, bringing people together. It's never been a very narrow approach to the structure of African society. So I think in order to convince people that's not a foreign concept, we need to draw on how those collaborations and cooperations have occurred, how people have worked across traditionally to have dealt with issues, how people have adapted between Western medicine and traditional medicine and being able to keep all of that in some integrated systems. And that didn't take complex planning, people from the outside. It happened internally, right? Or even how conflicts have been managed in many ways. So I think the critical thing is to talk about systems change by reflecting on how it is similar to some things that a structure of African society, rather than worrying about saying why it's not Western. That's the critical thing, because systems change is not a Western concept. It's any one of us in this seminar can see the fact that working collaboratively to change all components of society is a benefit, rather than doing one narrow part, intervening at one narrow level. So I think that's how we must engage in. But where we do make it a problem is those of us in the space like to pick up these catchphrases that come from the broader system change grouping. And those catchphrases start making it sound academic, make it sound foreign, and make it sound unique. So I think we have to take responsibilities, those of us who are pushing system change, for the way we have communicated systems change, to make it seem that it's not similar to African culture and traditions, which I would argue is absolutely untrue. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kovin. Yeah, I think the term itself, often sounds complex, sounds foreign, but I think the three of you have brought a lot of life and sort of reality to this concept through your examples and through your initiatives. Joseph, any others? I think we have only 30 seconds remaining, so I think we'll have to wrap up this session for now. I want to thank again our amazing speakers today. I want to thank the Siegel Family Foundation and the BMW Foundation for putting this conference together today, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of the summit. It's not over. And all the very best to all of you in the continuation of your journey as change makers in Africa. So thank you, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Bye.